It started on a Thursday night in mid-October. I had been working late at a law firm in downtown Chicago, trying to finish a pile of paperwork before the weekend. Most nights I drove, but my car had been in the shop for an oil change, and taking the bus seemed like the simplest option. I knew the route well enough, but I had never traveled it this late at night. The city had emptied, the usual hum of nightlife replaced by a quiet that felt almost unnatural, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. I left the office around 11:45 p.m., carrying my briefcase and wishing I had stayed earlier so I wouldn't be walking to the bus stop in the dark. The air was crisp, carrying that faint, metallic scent of approaching rain. The streets were dimly lit, the sidewalks wet from an earlier drizzle. I walked quickly, partly to warm myself, partly to get to the bus stop before the next vehicle arrived. The bus stop was a small metal shelter with a single flickering light. Only two other people were there. A man in his 40s, wearing a heavy coat, standing with his hands in his pockets, and a younger woman, probably in her 20s, huddled in a large hoodie and scrolling through her phone. I nodded politely and they nodded back, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't place. I tried to tell myself it was just the late hour, the emptiness of the streets. When the bus arrived, it hissed to a stop, doors folding open with a mechanical groan. I swiped my fare card and moved toward the back. The man and woman got on ahead of me, and I chose a seat near the rear, facing the aisle. The bus smelled faintly of damp fabric and oil, a smell I was familiar with, but which always made the ride feel longer. The first few minutes were normal. The bus rumbled along, passing closed storefronts and darkened buildings. Occasionally a car passed and had its headlights briefly illuminating the interior. But then I noticed the man. He wasn't just sitting quietly, he was staring at me. Not a casual glance, but a fixed stare that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my phone, scrolling through emails I had neglected, but every time I looked up, he was still staring. The woman across the aisle noticed too. She had stopped scrolling and kept glancing at him, her body slightly turned away. I told myself it was just paranoia, that he was tired or had a blank expression, but there was something off, something about the intensity of his gaze. The bus continued, and we passed a stretch of street where most of the lights were out. The flickering overhead lights on the bus made shadows jump and stretch unnaturally. I realized that the man's shadow on the ceiling was longer than it should be, moving almost independently from his body. My heart started to race. At the next stop, a few more passengers boarded, but I felt trapped. The man didn't shift in his seat, didn't acknowledge anyone else. His gaze remained fixed on me, and I could feel a cold tension in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The woman ahead whispered something under her breath, and I caught the words, "He's not real." I froze, not understanding what she meant. The bus lurched over a pothole, the lights flickered again, and for a split second, the man seemed to disappear from his seat. I blinked, and he was back, leaning slightly forward, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. His eyes were dark, impossibly dark, reflecting the flickering lights. "You shouldn't have taken this bus," he said, his voice low, almost a hiss. I tried to respond, tried to move, but my body refused. The woman ahead shrank in her seat, clutching her bag tightly. The bus groaned as it turned a corner, and I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of a nearby alley. It didn't move at first, then began walking parallel to the bus, silent and fluid, gliding rather than walking. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glinted in the dim light. When I looked back at the man, he was no longer in his seat. I couldn't figure out how he had moved so quickly, but he was now standing close, leaning toward me. The air around him felt colder, heavier, like a physical weight pressing down on me. "It's too late," he whispered. The bus jolted over another bump, and the lights went out completely for a second. When they flickered back on, the man was gone. The woman ahead had vanished as well. The bus seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled to my stop, heart pounding, unsure if what I had experienced was real. Outside, the street was empty, silent, normal. I walked the rest of the way home, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, overactive imagination. But the feeling of being watched, of being marked, lingered. Even now, months later, I feel that same unease when I hear a bus pull up late at night, when shadows stretch too long across a wall, when reflections in glass don't align with reality. I've avoided taking late-night buses since that night. I opt for ride shares or walk long distances, even if it's inconvenient. I've told a few friends cautiously about the experience. Most laughed it off, called it exhaustion or imagination. A few nodded quietly, as if they understood. They, too, had late-night experiences on public transportation, glimpses of something wrong, something impossible. Public transportation is meant to be mundane, predictable, safe. But I know now that it can harbor something else, something patient, deliberate, waiting for the perfect moment. It preys on isolation, on the moments when you are alone in a moving metal tube, disconnected from the world outside. One wrong ride, one night, and you could encounter it. Even now, when I hear the distant rumble of a bus, I tense. My skin prickles. I notice the long shadows cast by streetlights, the flicker of reflections in shop windows, the way dark figures seem to linger at the edges of vision. I know that somewhere, on some late-night route, a bus is carrying passengers who are unaware of the eyes watching them, the shadows stretching too long, the cold weight pressing down. I take precautions now. I never ride alone at night. I stay alert, I watch my surroundings, I keep to well-lit streets. But the memory of that night remains vivid, etched into my mind. The unblinking gaze, the unnatural shadow, the hissed warning. I know it is still out there, waiting, patient, deliberate, and I know that if I had been even a minute later or earlier, I might have been trapped in that corridor of shadows forever. Public transportation, ordinary and necessary, can hide extraordinary dangers. That night taught me that vigilance is not paranoia, it is survival. Ordinary is only a mask for what can exist at the edges of perception, moving silently until it chooses to reveal itself. I learned to respect it, to fear it, and to understand that one wrong ride can change your life forever. Even now, when I hear the hiss of bus doors opening, the metallic groan of the engine, I feel it. A chill along my spine, the echo of unblinking eyes, shadows that move when they shouldn't. I know that somewhere, someone else might be boarding that bus, alone, unaware, and I can only hope they are strong enough, aware enough to survive what waits for them. Public transportation is not just a route from point A to point B. It is a corridor where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet. It carries more than passengers. It carries the potential for fear, for danger, for encounters that defy reason. That night showed me the truth, and I carry it with me every time I leave the safety of my home and step into the streets. Story the end. It was the middle of October, and the city had started to adopt that peculiar chill that hinted at winter without fully committing. The streets were slick from an early rain, the kind that left the concrete dark and reflective, and most people had begun wearing jackets that looked far too thin for what was coming. I had recently started a new job in the financial district of the city, a position that required me to catch the subway every morning. I didn't own a car, and honestly, I preferred public transit. It gave me time to read, to think, to pretend I wasn't surrounded by strangers while being unavoidably close to them. That morning, like most, I left my apartment just as the sun was starting to drag itself over the skyline, the glow of the streetlights still lingering on wet asphalt. The subway station was nearly empty. I always liked early mornings like this, the emptiness giving me a sort of private world to occupy. I descended the escalator, passing the usual fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, the tiled walls streaked from years of moisture and neglect. I tapped my Metro card and went down the final steps to the platform, where I noticed a man sitting on the bench farthest from the stairs. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark coat that looked threadbare, his hair damp and combed straight back. He didn't look unusual in a city of commuters, but something about him made the back of my neck tighten. He stared at the ground, but his presence was heavy, like he had been waiting there a long time and he wasn't going anywhere. Most of the subway riders around him ignored him, lost in their phones or newspapers, but I felt his gaze brushing over me even though his head was down. I moved to sit at the other end of the platform, as far from him as possible, and waited. The train arrived, a long, screeching, groaning beast, and I stepped on with a sense of relief. Inside, the train smelled faintly of wet coats, metal, and the sour tang of too many people breathing in a confined space. I found a seat near the middle, hoping to distance myself from the few other passengers. Most of them were absorbed in their devices, but the man from the platform was there too, sitting across from me. He didn't look up. He didn't even glance around. The train lurched forward, and I felt that familiar sense of motion, the clack of metal wheels on rails echoing through the cars. I tried to shake off the unease. Subways were full of all sorts of people, and most of the time, the odd ones didn't do anything at all. But something about him was different. He smelled faintly like smoke, and something I couldn't identify. Something older, sharper. I kept my bag close to my body and watched as he slowly lifted his head, just enough for his eyes to meet mine. And that's when I realized his eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or blue, black as if the light itself refused to penetrate. I blinked. Maybe it was just a trick of the fluorescent lights, or maybe I had imagined it. I tried to focus on the screen of my phone, but I felt it, a cold, sinking feeling in my chest, like the kind that makes your stomach knot. The train stopped at the next station, and I watched him rise with a fluid motion, his coat hanging loosely as if he was heavier than he looked. He stepped off the train just as it began to pull away, and I exhaled, thinking the nightmare had ended. But when the train emerged from the station into the tunnel, I noticed him again, standing on the edge of the next platform ahead, staring at me. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe the angle, the lighting, the fatigue, it had to be a trick. The next day, I saw him again. Same station, same coat, same unnerving black eyes. And each day after that, his appearances were more frequent, more deliberate. I started noticing him on buses, too. The bus to work was crowded, but somehow I could always spot him, sitting in the back, always alone, always watching. If I looked away and then back, he would still be there, always there. It wasn't just that he was present, it was the way the other passengers reacted, or didn't. Nobody seemed to notice him. The old ladies knitting scarves, the businessmen reading stock reports, the teenagers with earbuds, they all passed him without a glance. Only I saw him, and he began to do things that made the fear tangible. On one particularly rainy evening, I boarded the subway later than usual. The car was nearly empty. I sat down, pulled out my book, and tried to focus. That's when I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was someone on the phone, murmuring into a headset, but the words were slow, deliberate, and in English. I know where you live. I froze. My eyes darted around. No one else on the train. I looked up, and he was sitting in the corner, only a few feet away now. His mouth moved, but his lips barely parted. The whisper didn't come from him. It came from inside my head. I could hear it clearly, a soft, crawling voice. I know where you live. The rest of the trip was a blur. I exited at the next station and walked as fast as I could down the street, ignoring the rain soaking my jacket. When I got home, I locked every door and window, drew the blinds, and sat in the dark. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, exhaustion, city paranoia. Maybe someone had been following me. Maybe it was a prank, someone messing with my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. The next week, the encounters escalated. He started appearing in my peripheral vision on the street, outside my office building, even at my gym. Every time I tried to confront him, he vanished. Not walking away, not blending into a crowd, vanished, like he had never been there. I began avoiding the subway altogether, taking long detours through the city, hailing cabs, but even then, I sometimes caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, standing on the curb as if waiting for me to leave the car. One night, after a late shift, I decided to take the bus home despite my fears. I needed to confront it. I needed to know if he was real or if I was losing my mind. The bus was nearly empty, and I chose a seat in the middle. 5 stops into the ride, the lights flickered. The engine groaned. And then I saw him, standing silently near the back door, as if he had been there the entire ride. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the air, even though the heat was on. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. He didn't move closer, but I knew he was aware of me, acutely aware. Then the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. I'm inside. I twisted my head, trying to find the source. The other passengers didn't hear it. They were engrossed in their phones, earbuds in, oblivious. My heart was hammering. I looked back toward him, but the bus lights flickered violently, and suddenly he wasn't there. I scanned the bus frantically, calling out, but only the echo of my own voice answered. I got off at the next stop and ran. My shoes splashed through puddles as I darted across the street, glancing back. No one there, nothing. Just the normal night sounds of the city, honking cars, distant footsteps, the drip of rain. My apartment felt like the only safe place, but even then, sleep was impossible. I started keeping the lights on, sleeping near the door with my phone in my hand. The whispers would come in the middle of the night, soft, insistent. Sometimes I would wake up to find him standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching, not moving, just there. I couldn't tell anyone. How do you explain something like this? I feared the reaction more than the figure itself. People would assume I was insane. My friends, my family, they'd call the authorities, they'd take me away. And yet, every day, he followed me in some way. The bus, the subway, the streets, outside buildings, in reflections, in shadows. He was everywhere I was. One evening, desperate and on the verge of a breakdown, I decided to record it. I set up my phone with the camera facing the living room while I sat in the kitchen pretending to watch TV. Hours passed. I didn't see him, didn't hear him. I went to check the footage. My stomach dropped. The first hour was normal, the phone capturing the empty room. But in the second hour, a dark figure appeared in the corner. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, but a fully formed figure. His eyes were black, impossibly black, reflecting no light. He tilted his head slowly toward the camera. Then the whisper, faint but unmistakable, "You can't hide." I turned off the phone. I couldn't watch anymore. I considered leaving the city, moving to another state, but even that felt pointless. He had been in buses, subways, streets, all over. Where would I go where he wouldn't find me? Weeks turned into months. My life shrank into routines designed around avoidance. I avoided public transportation entirely, stuck to cabs and walking the long way, always watching, always listening. But sometimes, when the city was quiet, I would catch a glimpse at a bus stop, in a store window, on the opposite side of a street. Always watching. Always there. One night, I was too tired to walk home, and I reluctantly boarded a late-night train. Only a handful of people were in the car. I sat near the door, gripping my bag tightly. The train lurched forward. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. When I opened them, he was standing right in front of me, closer than ever, his black eyes boring into mine. My heart felt like it had stopped. "I told you I know where you live," he said. Not a whisper this time. Clear. Audibly. Loud enough for the few other passengers to notice, though they pretended not to hear. I tried to get up. My legs refused. My mind screamed. I could feel his presence not just in the car, but inside me, inside my thoughts. The train seemed to stretch into infinity, the lights flickering violently, the metal of the car groaning. Then he leaned closer, and the temperature dropped sharply, frost forming on the edges of the windows. "You can't escape," he said. And then, as the train hurtled forward, he vanished. I ran off at the next stop. My apartment felt like the only haven, but I knew it wasn't safe. Every sound in the city could be him. Every shadow, every reflection, every stranger could be him. And yet, there was a strange truth I had to accept. The moment I looked away, the moment I stopped fearing, he would be gone. But the fear kept me alive, kept me aware. He had claimed my attention, my awareness, and in that I realized the horror wasn't just in his presence. It was in the inevitability, the inescapable certainty that he was everywhere, that the city itself could not hide me, that the very veins of public transportation, the trains, the buses, the stations, were his domain. Months later, I hear a new sound on the streets. A bus door sliding open, a train screeching into a station, and I can't help but look. Even from my apartment window across the street on the next platform, I know he is waiting, watching, always watching. I never take the subway now. I avoid the buses. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whisper again, soft and close, as if it's right next to my ear, right inside my mind. "I know where you live." Story the end. It was a Tuesday evening in Chicago, the kind of night that presses cold and damp into your bones. Rain had been falling all day, turning the streets into reflective rivers of yellow streetlights and blurred headlights. I had just finished my shift at a 24-hour diner downtown, and as usual, relied on public transportation to get home. My routine was simple: the red line to my stop near Logan Square, then a bus for the last 5 blocks. But that night, things would not be simple. The subway platform was nearly empty. The usual hum of the city seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling quiet that set my nerves on edge. A few scattered commuters waited for the train, heads down, headphones in, lost in their own worlds. I noticed one man immediately, a tall figure in a long black coat, cap pulled low over his face. He didn't sit on a bench, didn't scroll through his phone. He just stood perfectly still at the far end of the platform. The longer I looked at him, the heavier the feeling became, like gravity had doubled in that corner. He tilted his head slightly, and for a fraction of a second, I thought he was looking at me. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, the product of exhaustion after a 12-hour shift, and boarded the arriving train. I took a seat in the middle car, hoping to put distance between myself and the man. The train lurched forward, the familiar vibration under my feet doing little to soothe the tension rising in my chest. At first, the ride was normal. Other passengers were scattered, absorbed in phones or staring blankly out the windows. But something felt wrong. The man across from me, hood pulled over his head, had been staring directly at me for several stops. A woman by the window didn't move at all, her face expressionless, eyes fixed on the blurred city lights outside. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the rhythm of the tracks beneath us. Then I realized the train had passed my stop, not by a block or two, but by several stations. My stomach dropped. I had taken this route dozens of times, and yet the scenery outside felt unfamiliar. Streets I didn't recognize, buildings dark and empty. I approached the front to ask the driver, but when I looked, my breath caught. The driver's eyes were fixed on me, or maybe they weren't eyes at all, just dark voids reflecting nothing. His posture was rigid, unnatural. My voice caught in my throat when I asked where we were. He didn't answer. And then I saw him again, the tall man from the platform. Somehow he had appeared inside the train, at the back. He hadn't walked, he had simply materialized there, standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly, watching. The air in the car seemed to thicken, a pressure settling over my chest. My heart pounded as a low, indistinct whispering began, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands gripped the seat in front of me, knuckles white. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. The train itself seemed to stretch, aisles bending, seats elongating in impossible ways. The man moved closer, or maybe I was being pulled toward him. I couldn't tell. His presence was suffocating, cold, pressing into me from all sides. The other passengers were frozen, their heads slightly tilted toward me, faces pale and hollow. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. The whispers grew louder, a maddening cacophony that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I could feel his hand brush against my shoulder, or thought I could, but the chill that ran through me told me it was real. Panic surged and I struggled to scream, to move, but my body refused. And then, as suddenly as it began, the lights returned. I was no longer on the train. I stood alone in the middle of a cracked, empty street. The bus, the driver, the passengers, and the tall man were gone. The city around me was warped, buildings leaning at impossible angles, streetlights dim and flickering. Rain-slicked streets reflected the distorted lights. I ran, heart hammering, until I reached a familiar intersection and staggered into my apartment. The next day, I read the news. A train on my route had derailed late Tuesday night. Every passenger died. The tracks where it had happened were closed for maintenance weeks before. There was no explanation for how the train ended up there. My stomach turned. I had been on that train. I had seen him. For weeks, I avoided public transportation completely, walking miles or paying for ride shares. Eventually, necessity forced me back onto a bus after work. I planned meticulously, a route with bright lights, familiar stops, and buses not running the last shift. Relief washed over me as I waited at the well-lit station, convinced the previous night's experience had been a hallucination, exhaustion, a trick of my mind. But then I saw him. Across the platform at the far end, standing perfectly still, dark coat, baseball cap low over his face, head tilted. My chest tightened. I told myself it was paranoia, imagination, stress. I boarded the bus, took a seat near the middle, head down, trying to convince myself it would be fine. But I could feel him watching, the same suffocating pressure pressing into my chest. Shadows in my peripheral vision seemed to flicker unnaturally, shapes moving where they shouldn't. Halfway through the ride, the lights flickered, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the bus. The whispers returned, low, overlapping, coming from every corner, vibrating through my chest and skull. My hands gripped the seat in front of me. I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I froze, unable to breathe. When the lights returned, the bus was empty. I was alone. Outside, the city stretched desolate, distorted. I ran to the next stop, finally emerging into the night air, gasping. In the distance, I saw him, tilting his head, watching, patient, silent. Since that night, I avoid late-night public transportation. I take ride shares whenever possible, leave work early, and avoid the last buses and trains. Friends and family insist I'm paranoid, that it's exhaustion, hallucinations, or stress. But I know better. The city has shadows that aren't shadows, figures that aren't human. He exists, patient, watching, waiting. Sometimes when I pass a bus stop or subway entrance, I see him in the distance. Tilt of the head. Dark coat, stillness. He doesn't move. He waits, and I know that one day I will board a late-night bus or train, and he will be there, inevitable, patient, silent. I carry a flashlight, keep my phone charged, plan every route meticulously. But it isn't enough. He is out there, patient, eternal. And one day, the city and he will catch me again. Every rumble of a distant bus door, every hiss of a closing train, every flicker of a streetlight brings the memory crashing back. The whispers, the frozen passengers, the stretching aisles, the suffocating presence. Public transportation after dark is not just a convenience, it is a gamble. I have resigned myself to constant vigilance. Every step, every glance, every bus and train ride is calculated. But no matter how careful I am, I cannot escape completely. He is out there, waiting, and one day I will see him again, tilting his head, silent, inevitable. Story the end. It was just past midnight when I boarded the last bus heading out of downtown Chicago. I'd worked late at the advertising firm on State Street, and the office was eerily empty, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint click of my heels against the tile. The streets were wet from an earlier drizzle, the kind that left everything slick and glimmering under street lamps, and I'd promised myself I'd be home by 1. The bus stop was nearly deserted, just me and a man leaning against the sign, smoking, though his face was obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. I remember stepping onto the bus and immediately noticing the faint odor of something metallic, like blood mixed with the faint acrid smell of cleaning chemicals. The driver, a middle-aged woman with dark circles under her eyes, barely looked up from the dashboard as I swiped my transit card. She gave a nod, not quite friendly, not quite indifferent. The bus was mostly empty, just a few scattered passengers dozing or staring at their phones. I chose a seat toward the back near the window so I could watch the city dissolve into shadows as we moved along. Minutes into the ride, the man from the bus stop got on. I didn't pay him much attention at first, but he sat diagonally across from me, which felt unnerving. His presence had this weight, the kind that makes the air seem heavier, and even the faint rumble of the engine couldn't mask the tension he carried. I tried to focus on the music in my headphones, but the low hum of a conversation, or maybe it was just muttering, kept drawing my attention back. He was talking to himself, or at least it sounded like it. The bus jolted over a pothole, and I looked up. The man was staring at me now, not in the casual way a stranger might, but as though he could see something in me. I tried to ignore it, pretending to be absorbed in my phone. Every so often I caught him whispering, turning his head slightly so he wasn't looking at anyone else. My heart rate started to climb. I've always had a gut instinct about people, and something about him didn't sit right. After a few stops, the bus picked up more passengers, but the man stayed silent. His eyes never left mine. Then, out of nowhere, he got up and walked toward the front, weaving through the narrow aisle. The other passengers didn't react. They were either too tired, too absorbed in their screens, or maybe they just didn't see him the way I did. When he reached the front, he didn't say anything to the driver. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, and then I noticed his hand. It was trembling slightly. I couldn't tell if he was holding something, but his fist was clenched tightly. I texted my roommate to tell her I'd be home in a few minutes. My fingers were shaking, and I kept glancing at him. He started moving back down the aisle, and my stomach sank when he passed my seat. He leaned slightly as he walked, as though he were angling his body to watch me, and my instincts screamed at me to stand up, to make a scene, to anything. But fear had frozen me in place. The next few stops blurred together. I remember the sound of the doors opening and closing, the faint smell of wet asphalt mixing with the smell of the bus, and the low, rhythmic tapping of his shoes on the floor. At one point, he sat directly across from me. His eyes were wide now, unblinking, and he smiled. Not the polite, nervous kind, but the slow, deliberate curl of someone who had been waiting for this moment. My phone slipped from my hands, and when I bent down to pick it up, I felt him lean forward just slightly, close enough that I could hear him whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Panic set in. I tried to speak, but my voice caught. I told myself it was just my imagination, that he probably didn't mean anything. But when I glanced out the window, the city had changed. It wasn't the familiar streets anymore. The buildings looked taller, darker, and the streetlights flickered inconsistently. I knew instinctively that we weren't on the normal route. I stood up and walked to the front, trying to get the driver's attention. "Can you tell me what stop this is?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Her eyes were glazed, almost hollow, and she kept staring at the road as if she were following some invisible set of directions. I looked back, and the man was standing at the back, watching me again. That smile had stretched wider, grotesquely wide, like he knew something I didn't. The bus slowed, and I noticed that no one else on it seemed to react. They were all asleep or staring blankly at their phones, oblivious. I realized then that I was the only one awake, the only one who could see what was happening. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I remembered the emergency button near the driver's seat, but reaching it meant passing him again. I took a deep breath and tried to reason with myself. Maybe if I stayed calm, if I didn't make a scene, I'd be okay. I edged my way toward the button, and as I did, he leaned across the aisle, whispering, "You can't leave. Not yet." His breath was cold, rancid, and smelled faintly of iron. My stomach twisted in fear, and I yanked myself past him, pressing the emergency button so hard I thought I might break it. The bus stopped immediately. The lights flickered, and the engine cut out. Everyone on the bus slumped forward, and for a moment the entire vehicle was silent, except for my ragged breathing. I turned to confront him, but he was gone. I could feel him watching me, though. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I opened the door and stumbled out into the street. It was raining again, lightly, and the city lights reflected off the slick pavement. I looked around frantically. The street was empty except for the occasional car passing by. I tried to find the bus, but it was gone. I walked quickly toward a 24-hour diner I knew was nearby, my shoes squelching on the wet sidewalk, and I didn't stop until I was inside, dripping wet and shaking. I called the police and reported what happened. They asked questions, took notes, but their tone suggested disbelief. They said nothing about any unusual bus routes or missing drivers, just that sometimes late-night rides attract strange people. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept seeing his eyes, his smile, and the way he had whispered. The next morning I checked the transit website. There was no record of the bus route I had taken, no reports of malfunctions, detours, or anything unusual. I asked a friend who works for the city if they could track the GPS of buses overnight. They said the system shows every route, every stop. Nothing matched what I described. For weeks afterward, I avoided public transportation at night. I started driving myself everywhere, even if it took longer. But there were moments when I'd see a bus in the distance, and I could swear I saw him sitting in the back, staring, waiting. I changed my routine, my commute, even my schedule. But the feeling never left me. It was like a shadow clinging to the edges of my life. A month later, I had to take the bus again for a meeting. Daytime this time, of course. I boarded cautiously, sitting near the middle, keeping my head down. The bus driver was cheerful, chatting with passengers. Everything seemed normal. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Halfway through the route, I noticed a man in a hooded sweatshirt sitting in the very back, staring at me. His face was still obscured, but I knew. I jumped up, preparing to move to another seat, but the bus lurched violently and the lights flickered. Every single passenger froze, staring straight ahead. The hooded man remained at the back, unblinking, smiling. The bus stopped in the middle of an intersection, engine dead. Cars honked around us, but the world outside seemed unreal, muted, distant. I grabbed my bag and ran toward the driver's door. She turned, and her eyes were black, completely black, with no whites at all. She whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I slammed the door open, leaped out, and ran across the street. The bus didn't follow. It just sat there idle as if waiting. When I turned around, it was gone, vanished like smoke. After that day, I never took the bus again. I drive everywhere, even when it's inconvenient. I avoid late night errands, late night anything. But sometimes, when I'm at a red light or parked somewhere quiet, I see a bus in the distance, lights flickering, and I know he's out there, waiting, watching. And I can feel the same cold whisper brushing against my mind. You can't leave. Not yet. Years have passed, but that fear has never left me. I've read online about other people reporting strange experiences on public transportation, missing stops, unaccounted for passengers, buses that disappear. Some dismiss it as hallucinations, sleep deprivation, or anxiety. But I know better. I lived it. I felt it. And sometimes when I least expect it, I swear I hear the faint tap of shoes on a bus floor behind me, even when I'm alone in my car, and I know he hasn't forgotten. Story the end. It started like any other Monday morning. The sky was gray, low-hanging clouds pressing against the city like a weight, and the streets were slick from the early fall rain. I left my apartment around 6:15 a.m., umbrella tucked under my arm, MetroCard in hand, ready to board the subway that would take me to my job downtown. I had been commuting this way for nearly 3 years, so I thought I knew the rhythm of the trains, the people, the occasional oddities that made city life slightly unsettling but never truly dangerous. As I descended the escalator into the subway station, I noticed the usual crowd of early risers, a few suited men scrolling through their phones, a woman with a toddler clinging to her leg, the habitual street musician setting up by the stairs. But then I saw him, an older man, sitting alone on a bench at the far end of the platform. He was thin, with a long, gray coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in months, a slouch that suggested either exhaustion or something heavier. His face was partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, and though his head was tilted down, I felt his eyes on me. It was an instinctive, gnawing feeling that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated, then moved toward the opposite end of the platform, convinced I was imagining things. The train pulled in with its usual screech, the doors opening to a wave of heat and noise. I stepped on and took a seat near the middle, hoping the motion and the familiar hum of the car would distract me from the man I'd seen. But he was there too, standing at the other end of the car, coat dripping slightly from the rain outside. He didn't move closer, didn't sit. He just stood, perfectly still, staring. I tried to read my phone, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept stealing glances at him, noticing details that should have been impossible. His eyes weren't black or brown or any color I could identify. They were voids, completely empty, as if looking into them would swallow you. My pulse quickened. The next station arrived, and he exited with the rest of the passengers, disappearing into the gray morning. I exhaled, thinking I was safe, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I saw him again. Same station, same coat, same empty eyes. And soon, I began noticing him elsewhere. On the bus I took when the subway was delayed, across the street when I left work, occasionally glimpsed in reflective surfaces when I wasn't expecting it. He was everywhere and nowhere. No one else seemed to notice him. I mentioned him to a coworker once. She gave me a blank stare, then suggested maybe I was tired, stressed, imagining things. I tried to ignore him, tried to convince myself it was paranoia. But the incidents grew stranger, more invasive. One evening, I was taking the subway home late, the car nearly empty. I sat near the window, headphones in, trying to distract myself. That's when I heard it, a whisper, slow and deliberate, faint, but unmistakable. I know where you live. I ripped my headphones off, scanning the car. No one else was there. Then I saw him standing near the back door as though he had been there the entire ride. My skin prickled and my stomach churned. I wanted to move, to get away, but my legs refused to cooperate. The whisper came again, inside my head this time, more insistent. You can't hide. I stumbled off the train at the next stop, running down the street in the rain, glancing back. He was nowhere to be seen. My apartment felt like the only safe place, but sleep was impossible. I kept lights on, doors locked, blinds drawn. Every sound, the creak of the radiator, a car passing, the wind rattling the windows, felt like him moving through my home. Days passed, but I couldn't escape him. The public transportation network, the very arteries of the city, seemed to belong to him. He was always present, always watching. Sometimes I caught him on buses, sometimes on the subway platforms, occasionally just across the street, blending into shadows, appearing and disappearing at will. I tried recording him, filming my apartment and streets, but the footage revealed only darkness where he stood. Like the camera itself refused to capture him. I avoided the subway entirely, sticking to walking long routes or calling cabs. But even then, glimpses of him would appear in reflections, the rearview mirrors, windows of shops in the corner of my eye. He was there and he was patient. He didn't rush me. He didn't need to. The slow, unrelenting presence was far worse than any immediate threat. One particularly dark night, I had no choice but to take the late-night bus. I was exhausted, my legs stiff, and the rain had soaked through my coat. I entered the bus and took a seat near the middle, gripping my bag like a shield. The bus crawled through wet streets, stopping infrequently. And then I saw him. Standing silently at the back of the bus, the edges of his coat dripping, eyes black and unyielding. "You shouldn't be out," he said, voice low but audible, every syllable resonating inside my skull. The few passengers on the bus seemed oblivious, engrossed in their phones. I wanted to call out, to scream, but my throat was dry, tight. My chest heaved as I tried to process reality. The bus felt smaller, the air thick, electric, as if charged with some malevolent intent. I didn't move until we reached the next stop, then bolted for the doors, slipping in puddles, heart hammering. Back in my apartment, I realized the pattern. He was tied to the transportation itself. Trains, buses, stations, streets intersecting with transit lines. Every time I took a route, he was there. I thought of moving, changing cities, but he wasn't bound to one neighborhood. The entire transit system seemed like his domain. And I understood, with sinking dread, that my life was now orchestrated by him. My routes, my times, my movements, everything dictated by the need to avoid him. Weeks turned into months. I slept in short bursts, lights on, doors locked. I stopped answering calls and texts from friends. The only human contact I allowed was the occasional taxi driver, the brief interaction of payment, a nod, and then silence. He never followed in taxis, never appeared inside cars, but I knew it was only because the roads themselves were not his realm. The trains, the buses, they were his kingdom. And I was an intruder. One day, out of desperation, I tried to confront him. I boarded the subway during off-peak hours, almost empty. I walked toward him, my shoes echoing on the tile platform, heart pounding like a drum. He was there, same coat, same posture, black eyes reflecting nothing. "Why me?" I asked, voice trembling, absurd in its bravado. He didn't respond at first. Then, in a low, deliberate whisper, the kind that bypassed ears and lodged directly into my mind, "Because you see me, because you fear me, and fear makes you notice. Others are blind." I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but the words were a trap. I felt the cold seeping from him, like frost crawling over my skin, the city itself growing dark and hostile around me. And then he stepped onto the train with me. The doors closed, the lights flickered, every other passenger vanished. I was alone with him, the rumble of the train echoing like the heartbeat of some giant, unseen creature. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The train twisted through tunnels I didn't recognize, stops that didn't exist, corridors that extended into infinity. He remained standing, unblinking, silent, waiting. I realized in that moment that the horror wasn't just in his presence. It was in the inevitability, the certainty that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, I was never truly alone in the city, never safe in its veins of steel and concrete. Eventually, the train emerged, though where, I don't know. He stepped off first, and I followed instinctively, not wanting to be left behind. Outside, the streets were wet, empty, and unfamiliar. He didn't move toward me, didn't speak. He simply faded into the shadows, leaving a void of presence that still lingered. Since then, I never take the subway. I avoid buses. I walk long routes, hail cabs, drive whenever possible. But sometimes late at night, I hear the faint screech of a train in the distance, the subtle hiss of a bus door opening, and I know he is near. Waiting, watching. The city's veins are his, and I am forever an observer, bound to his silent dominion. And when I close my eyes, I sometimes hear it, a whisper that crawls along the edges of thought, the same words I heard that first night. "I know where you live." Story, the end. It was a Wednesday night in early November, the kind of night when the chill in the air made the streets feel empty before they even were. I had stayed late at the hospital, covering a shift at the emergency department where I worked as a lab technician, and I was exhausted. I usually drove, but my car was in the shop for a minor repair, so I had no choice but to take the city bus home. I had taken it a few times before, but never this late. Most of the time, the bus was crowded, but this night was different. Nearly everyone had already gone home, leaving the bus quiet, almost too quiet. I walked to the bus stop near the hospital, a small shelter with a flickering light that made shadows dance across the ground. Only a few people were waiting. A young man in his 20s, wearing a hoodie pulled tight around his face, and an older woman with a cane who kept looking down the street as if she expected something. I nodded politely at them, and they nodded back. There was an odd stillness in the air, the kind that makes you aware of every small sound, the rustle of leaves, a distant dog barking, the faint hum of traffic. When the bus arrived, it hissed and groaned as it pulled up. I swiped my card and moved toward the back, the young man following and taking a seat across the aisle from me. The older woman shuffled to a seat closer to the front. The interior smelled faintly of cleaning solution and damp fabric, a smell that always makes me tense in these nearly empty buses. I tried to focus on my phone to distract myself, but the silence was oppressive. At first, everything seemed normal. The bus moved along the empty streets, stopping occasionally to pick up a passenger here or there. But after a few minutes, I noticed the young man staring. Not a casual glance, but an unbroken, unblinking stare. It made my skin crawl. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe he was just tired or bored. But there was something unnatural about the way he held his eyes on me, as though he could see everything inside my mind. As the bus continued, I began to notice other strange things. The shadows under the flickering lights seemed to move in ways that didn't match the bus's motion. When the bus hit a bump, his shadow stretched and twisted along the ceiling, far longer than it should have. My heart started pounding. I tried to focus on my phone, but my screen felt like it was flickering too, the images distorted. A few stops later, a young woman in her early 20s got on the bus, carrying a large tote bag. She looked exhausted, like she had been waiting all night. She sat several rows ahead of us and kept glancing back at the young man, her expression uneasy. I realized she must feel it too. Something was off, though no one would speak of it. The bus took a turn onto a dimly lit industrial street, the kind of area where warehouses sit empty and streetlights are sparse. The interior lights of the bus flickered violently, throwing the interior into alternating pools of light and darkness. I felt a cold creep along my spine, a sensation that seemed to emanate from the young man. He leaned slightly forward, and for a brief moment I felt as if he could reach inside my mind, know every thought I was having. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said in a low voice, almost a hiss, and I could feel it echo in my skull. I froze. My body refused to move. The woman ahead whispered something under her breath, but I couldn't make out the words. The bus continued along the uneven streets, and I realized that none of the passengers had reacted. They sat, almost frozen, as if aware of something they couldn't name. The driver's eyes remained forward, calm, oblivious to the tension. The bus lurched over a pothole, and the lights flickered out completely for a moment. When they came back on, the young man was gone. I blinked, unsure if he had ever been there. The shadows on the ceiling and walls returned to normal. The bus continued its route, and I tried to speak to the other passengers, but they seemed distant, disconnected, staring straight ahead. By the time the bus reached my stop, I was trembling. I stepped off into the cold night, heart racing, and glanced back. There was no sign of him, no evidence that he had ever been there. The bus pulled away, empty except for the driver, who didn't glance back. I walked home the rest of the way, each shadow along the street feeling alive, each sound amplified. I tried to rationalize it the next day. Fatigue, stress, overactive imagination. None of it explained the sensation of being watched, of something cold and deliberate pressing against the edges of my mind. I checked online for reports of unusual occurrences on late-night buses, and I found scattered mentions, people seeing shadows move, hearing whispers, feeling watched, but no concrete answers. Friends laughed when I told them. A few nodded quietly, clearly remembering experiences they hadn't shared. I avoided late-night buses after that night. I took taxis, ride shares, or walked, even when it was inconvenient. But the memory lingered, vivid and oppressive. The young man's unblinking eyes, the impossibly long shadows, the hissed words that echoed in my skull. I noticed small signs in daily life, shadows that moved oddly, reflections that seemed delayed, the subtle sensation of being observed. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent, like a low hum under my consciousness. Months later, I took a bus during the day. The streets were crowded, the sunlight flooding through the windows. The atmosphere was normal, mundane, almost comforting. But when I looked at the reflections in the glass, I thought I saw him sitting across from me, staring. I blinked, and he was gone. A trick of light, I told myself. A trick of the mind. But a part of me knew better. I learned to travel with awareness. I watch people closely now, notice their behaviors, the way shadows fall, the movement at the edges of perception. I never ride alone at night. I avoid empty streets, dimly lit stops, late-night buses. And yet, sometimes when I hear the faint rumble of a bus in the distance, I can't help but feel the chill creep up my spine, the echo of those eyes, the whisper that still seems to linger in my mind. Public transportation is meant to be ordinary, mundane, safe. But I know better. I have seen what can exist in the ordinary, what can linger unnoticed until the perfect moment. The line between safety and danger is thin, and late at night, the bus becomes a vessel for something else, something patient, deliberate, and observant. One wrong ride, one lapse in attention, and you may find yourself in a situation you cannot explain, a reality you cannot escape. Even now, I notice the buses. I notice the empty seats, the shadows, the flicker of lights in dim stations. I know that somewhere, someone boards a bus alone, late at night, unaware of what may be observing them, waiting, patient and deliberate. I learned that night to respect those spaces, to understand that the ordinary can hide the extraordinary. Public transportation is more than a route from point A to point B. It is a corridor where the mundane intersects with something darker, something that waits, always watching. I learned that vigilance is not paranoia, it is survival. Story the end. It was just past 6 a.m, a chill clinging to the city as the sun struggled to rise. The streets were wet from an overnight rain, reflecting the harsh glow of streetlights that had refused to go out. I wrapped my coat tighter and pulled my scarf over my mouth, trying to ward off the cold. The subway station was quiet, only the occasional commuter hurrying down the escalator, headphones in, coffee in hand. I had started a new job downtown, which meant long, early commutes through the veins of the city, riding trains that seemed to carry not just passengers, but the weight of every untold story in the city. I descended into the station, tapping my Metro card against the scanner, and moved to the platform. Most of the benches were empty, save for one man sitting at the far end. He was older, thin, and wore a long, dark coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His hat shadowed his face, and his posture was stiff, unnervingly so. Something about him felt off, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on it. I shrugged it off. People were strange in the morning, some in a hurry, some lost in thought. The train arrived, its metal screeching as it slowed to a stop. I stepped in, choosing a seat in the middle of the car, hoping the motion would help me ignore the man. But he was there too, standing near the back. I tried not to stare, focusing on the screen of my phone, but a strange sense of dread began to settle in my chest. His eyes, at least what I could see, were dark, unnaturally so. I looked away, convincing myself it was just the angle of the lights, just my imagination. Days passed, and the sightings continued. He seemed to be everywhere I went on public transportation, always alone, always watching. No one else seemed to notice him. On buses, I would see him sitting silently at the back, a shadow among the few scattered passengers. On the subway, he would appear at the opposite end of the car, standing perfectly still. I mentioned it to a friend once, joking about it, but he laughed it off. "You're just seeing someone who's bored of life," he said. I wasn't joking, and I wasn't seeing things. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was someone on their phone, murmuring into a headset, but the words were slow, deliberate. "I know where you live." I froze, scanning the car, but no one else was there. He was standing closer now, eyes locked on me, expression unreadable. My pulse raced, and I left the train at the next stop, running into the cold, wet streets. The encounters grew more frequent. He began to appear outside stations, on street corners, sometimes across from my apartment building. I started taking longer, more convoluted routes to avoid him, but it seemed pointless. He could be anywhere at any time, always observing. My fear deepened, morphing into paranoia. I stopped telling anyone, stopped trying to rationalize it. The city itself felt hostile, like a trap designed specifically for me. One night, exhausted and desperate, I decided to record my apartment. I set up my phone to capture the living room while I sat in the kitchen, pretending to watch TV. Hours passed. Nothing unusual happened until I reviewed the footage. In the corner of the frame, a shadowy figure appeared, black eyes staring directly into the camera. My blood ran cold as the whisper came again, not from the speakers, but from inside my head. You can't hide. I tried to avoid public transportation entirely, but it wasn't enough. Even walking the streets, I felt him near. Reflections in windows, shadows shifting too quickly, the faint impression of movement behind me. He was everywhere, patient, silent, and relentless. Weeks later, I took a late-night bus out of exhaustion. The car was nearly empty, and I chose a seat in the middle, gripping my bag tightly. Halfway through the ride, I saw him at the back, standing, watching. The air grew cold, my breath visible even though the heat was on. The few passengers around me didn't notice, oblivious to the creeping terror that filled the space. Then he leaned forward slightly, voice low, clear, and unmistakable. I'm inside. I bolted from the bus at the next stop, running through puddles, my heart hammering. My apartment felt like the only safe place, but even there, I couldn't escape. Sometimes I would wake to see him in the corner of my bedroom, not moving, just observing. The fear became a constant companion, shaping every decision, every route, every action. I began to understand a pattern. His domain was the public transportation system, the trains, buses, stations, the very pathways that connected the city. Wherever I took these routes, he appeared. It wasn't just stalking, it was omnipresence within the network. Moving to another city seemed futile. He could follow, or he could be waiting in the veins of the next place I entered. Months passed, my life shrinking around routines designed to avoid him. I never rode the subway, rarely took buses. I relied on taxis, long walks, and avoidance. But sometimes when the city was quiet and the streets empty, I would see a glimpse. Him at a distance, at a corner, in the shadows. My pulse would quicken, my body tensing even when the streets were empty, even when I was home. One night, out of sheer exhaustion and a desperate need for understanding, I boarded the subway during off-peak hours. I walked toward him, shoes echoing against the tile platform. He was standing there, the same coat, same posture, black eyes reflecting nothing. Why me? I asked, voice trembling. He didn't respond immediately. Then a low whisper crawled directly into my mind. Because you see me, because you fear me, and fear makes you notice. Others are blind. I realized then that the horror was not only in his presence, it was in the inevitability, the certainty that no matter what I did, I could never escape the reach of his domain. The public transportation network had become his kingdom, and I was a permanent observer, trapped by fear, my movements dictated by his silent control. Eventually, the train emerged, though I don't know where. He stepped off first, and I followed instinctively, not wanting to be left behind. Outside, the streets were wet, empty, and unfamiliar. He didn't move toward me or speak. He simply faded into the shadows, leaving a void that lingered long after. Since then, I avoid trains and buses entirely. I take taxis, walk longer routes, drive whenever possible. Yet sometimes late at night, I hear the distant screech of a train, the hiss of a bus door opening, and I know he is near. Waiting. Watching. The veins of the city, the public transportation arteries, belong to him, and I am forever marked, forced to navigate a city under the gaze of something that knows where I live, something that waits patiently, always silently, for the moment I falter. Even now, when the rain falls and the streets glisten with the reflection of streetlights, I find myself pausing at the sound of a distant train, heart pounding. I glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him in the shadows, black eyes fixed on me. The terror is not in the immediate threat, but in the relentless awareness that he can appear anywhere, anytime, and I will never be safe in the veins of the city's public transportation system. And when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes hear it, a whisper that crawls along the edges of my mind, soft and deliberate. I know where you live. Story the end. It started on a late Tuesday evening, just after 9. Um, the streets in that part of the city were quiet, almost too quiet for a weekday night. I had just finished my shift at the diner, and the fatigue in my legs made me long for the warmth of my apartment. I wasn't far from the subway station, just a 15-minute walk, but as soon as I turned onto the side street leading to the station entrance, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I shrugged it off. I always got that uneasy sensation in dimly lit streets. I told myself it was just the long hours and lack of sleep. The subway station was empty when I got there. Only a single ticket booth clerk was present, scrolling through her phone, headphones in, oblivious to the world. I tapped my Metro card and walked down the stairs into the cavernous underground. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was oddly comforting, and I felt a little better. I checked the schedule board. The last train for my line was in about 10 minutes. I found a bench and sat down. There were maybe 3 other people waiting. A man in a wrinkled suit staring blankly at the floor, a woman in a hoodie scrolling on her phone, and an older man clutching a newspaper that looked like it had been folded the same way for decades. The silence between us was heavy, almost tangible. After a few minutes, the sound of approaching wheels on the tracks made me stand up. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open. The 3 other people I had noticed walked aboard, leaving me alone to board last. I stepped into the carriage and immediately noticed how cold it felt, even though the heat usually ran warm this time of year. I moved down the aisle and found a seat near the middle. As the train began to move, the lights flickered. It was brief, just a twitch, spat, but it was enough to make me glance around. Everyone else seemed unaffected, either lost in their phones or staring blankly out the windows. The train rattled along the tracks for a few stops without incident, then came to a sudden, jarring halt. The screech of metal echoed in the empty carriage, and the lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging us into partial darkness. I heard a voice somewhere behind me. It was soft, almost indistinguishable, like someone whispering from far away. I turned, but no one was there. I could see the other passengers, sitting rigid and silent, not reacting at all. I tried to shake the feeling of unease. The train driver's voice came over the intercom, but it was distorted, almost robotic. "We are experiencing delays. Please remain on the train." The distortion made my skin crawl. The train started moving again, but at an irregular pace. Stops came and went, but the doors didn't open. I realized the stations were all wrong, unfamiliar names scrolling past the windows. Panic started to bubble in my chest. I pressed the call button, but nothing happened. No chime, no voice, nothing. I got up and walked down the aisle, peering into the other cars. They were all empty except for shadows, long black shapes that seemed to move at the edges of my vision. Every time I blinked, they disappeared. When I reached the last car, I noticed a man standing by the door, his back to me. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and completely still. His presence was oppressive, like the air around him had weight. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't turn. I stepped closer, and then the lights flickered again. When they came back, he was gone. My heart was hammering, and the train suddenly jerked violently, throwing me against the wall. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard whispers all around me, indecipherable murmurs, overlapping, echoing. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. The lights returned, but something had changed. The other passengers' heads were turned toward me, faces expressionless, their eyes dark, hollow. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The train lurched again, faster this time, and I stumbled toward the door. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic turned to terror. I banged on it, shouting for someone, anyone, to help me, but the only sound was the echo of my own voice, distorted and warped. A smell hit me suddenly, metallic and coppery, like blood. It made me gag. I realized it was coming from the air vents. I looked around. The lights flickered one last time and then stabilized. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, silent except for the screech of the rails. I ran down the aisle to the nearest door and pounded on it. That's when I noticed something impossible. Outside the window, the tunnel wasn't familiar. The walls were lined with grime, graffiti that I hadn't seen before. The tracks twisted impossibly, looping and turning in ways that didn't make sense. My stomach dropped. I knew this wasn't the route I had taken countless times. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the car behind me. I spun around, but again, nothing was there. The train shook violently, and a voice echoed through the car, not over the intercom, but directly in my head. You shouldn't be here. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps came closer, though I still couldn't see anyone. Shadows flickered along the walls like they were crawling toward me. I backed into a corner, clutching the pole for support. The whispers started again, louder this time, forming words I couldn't fully comprehend. The train stopped abruptly, and the doors opened to a station bathed in harsh white light. I ran out without thinking, down the platform, but as soon as I stepped onto it, the train vanished. There was no sign it had ever been there. I looked around. The station was empty, and the exits led to streets I didn't recognize. I wandered for what felt like hours, trying to find something familiar. The streets were eerily quiet, the city lights dim and flickering. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me further into an unfamiliar maze, and always just at the edge of my vision, I saw them, shadows moving with me, always keeping their distance, but never letting me forget they were there. Eventually I found a street sign that I recognized. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I turned a corner and saw the same subway entrance where I had begun. Only this time, it looked wrong, older, worn, like it belonged to another era. The station sign was rusted, the paint peeling. I hesitated, but exhaustion and fear pushed me forward. I went down the stairs. The station was empty, the lights dim. I found a train waiting. On instinct, I got in, hoping it would take me home. The train started moving, and for a while, everything seemed normal. The familiar stops passed by, the lights flickered in their usual pattern. I began to relax, thinking I had escaped whatever nightmare I had wandered into. But then I noticed him, standing at the end of the car watching me. The man in the long coat. His face was pale, almost translucent, his eyes black voids. My stomach dropped. The train wasn't slowing down, wasn't stopping. I pressed the emergency button. Nothing. The man began to move toward me, gliding silently down the aisle. Every step he took, the lights dimmed further, shadows stretching across the car like dark fingers. I scrambled to the nearest door, yanking at the handle, but it was locked. He reached out and the air turned icy. I could see my breath, even though the train was supposed to be heated. My vision blurred, panic consuming me. The whispers returned, screaming now, a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. I felt my knees buckle, and just as he was about to reach me, the train jolted violently. I was thrown to the floor, and when I looked up, I was back at the station I recognized, the train doors open and a regular passenger train waiting. The man was gone. The shadows had vanished. I stumbled out, shaking, heart hammering. I ran home, not looking back. I didn't ride the subway again for months. When I finally did, I stayed near the driver's cab, refusing to take my eyes off the tracks. I told myself it had been a hallucination, sleep deprivation, stress. But deep down, I knew better. Sometimes late at night, I still hear whispers when I close my eyes. I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision. And every so often, I swear I see a man in a long coat watching me from the corner of a subway platform. It's been years, but I still ride the train cautiously. I avoid empty cars. I avoid late nights. But the fear never goes away because I know what waits in the darkness of the subway tunnels, just beyond the reach of the lights, waiting for the next person foolish enough to ride alone at night. Story the end.